NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte addressed a crowd today or an audience in which he said that the alliance, in its meeting with The Hague that's coming up very shortly, here later this month, it's going to be a quantum leap, he said, a defining moment for the alliance. What he didn't describe was, and didn't explain actually what that quantum leap was to, the implication being something good. But when listening to what he's saying and what is planned to come next, I think it's more likely a quantum leap to ruin. This is not going to help the alliance. What he's talking about now is going to be so expensive, I doubt very seriously that they're ever going to even achieve the objectives he's seeking. And why then would we want to pursue something that is in all probability may bankrupt us? You know, we've always used to mock at the Soviet Union about how Ronald Reagan's military buildup in the 1980s was partially responsible, and some say mostly responsible, for the collapse of the Soviet Union, because they tried to keep up with this. They tried to have all this spending to keep up with what we were doing, and it ended up collapsing their economy. There was more to it than that, but there was some truth to it, that by the Soviet Union trying to keep up with what the Reagan, at least buildup, was ostensibly supposed to do, it ended up bankrupt because they had a weak economy to start with. They had actually a moribund economy. We don't want to revisit that and do it again in reverse. And I fear right now that we're on a track to do that. Look, the NATO alliance, as the adherents of it say all the time, used to be, anyway, the most successful defensive alliance in history. That's what they always brag about themselves, except they use it in the present tense. And basically that an alliance is now going to be a permanent feature forever. That's the way that they're talking about it now. There is no contemplation on anyone's mind at all that says NATO should ever or will ever do anything except expand. I mean, they're even now trying to go into the Asia-Pacific area, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and we want to go into the Asia-Pacific. I mean, you're going to have to change the letters or something. But this just shows you the real problem with this. This was warned about. This issue of alliances and permanent alliances was warned in his famous farewell address, and I think it was 1789, I think, George Washington, when he said we should not have permanent alliances. We should not have permanent enemies either, or even permanent friends. We should take care of our country first and foremost, and when it makes sense to be part of an alliance, be part of an alliance. When it doesn't make sense to be part of an alliance, don't be part of an alliance. Here's what no longer even gets considered. Is there a need to have the NATO organization now? Now, I would argue that especially after 1992, say, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and then a ton of the countries that were in the Warsaw Pact ended up joining the NATO country. At that point, the whole reason for NATO existing from 1949 all the way through the collapse of the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union collapsed and fell apart, there was no longer a need, and the very reason for our organization vanished. If you talk about a parade and celebration, that would have been the perfect time to say we're going to phase out NATO because we don't need it any longer. There is no longer this overarching enemy here that has 50,000 tanks and thousands of fighters and missiles and all that kind of stuff, all the nuclear weapons against which you had to have a unified front. At the time NATO was formed, it was very important, critical, and useful to the United States and to Europe at large, because there was a no kidding, genuine threat from the communist USSR in the East. Okay, then we had the Cold War for all those decades, and then all of a sudden, now the balance of power is shifting in the direction of NATO. The Western economies are booming. The Soviet economies are moribund. The command-directed economy and all that kind of stuff, state-sponsored, et cetera, it just wasn't working. The quality of life was going down. The capabilities were going down. And then the thing just rusted and fell apart. At that point, there was no more a reason to have a NATO, a North Atlantic Treaty Alliance against this. Alliances are only useful insofar as that if your national security of any given country is not sufficient to defend itself, and then you have to have someone else to help you. Because the Soviet Union was this big behemoth, and individual European countries probably wouldn't have been able to stand up to it. So it made sense to have an alliance then. It doesn't anymore. Certainly didn't in the 1990s forward, but even today, That's not something that's really useful. Now, I have to say that, I have to caveat that by saying that would have been the case if we hadn't have gone to war against Russia via the proxy of Ukraine in 2022, because now then Russia is bigger and stronger than we were. So now then they actually do pose a threat to people, and it's going to cause many members to say we have to stand together. Okay, I'm not suggesting that we get rid of NATO today. That day can come. We should aspire to the day that we can get rid of NATO, because that means we're in a position to where we don't have to be worried about a threat of invasion of this big behemoth over here in the East. That day is not now. We have kind of screwed that for ourselves because of the way we behaved. And now that instead of weakening Russia, like we arrogantly thought that the war with Ukraine was going to do, was going to crush Russia's economy, was going to harm their military, set them back, and all this kind of stuff, ended up having the exact opposite effect on both the economic front and the military front. Now then, Russia is substantially more powerful today militarily than they were. Their economy is stronger than all of the Western Europe combined. 4% growth, Voss, I think 1% growth in last year. I don't know. Apparently, it's going to be somewhere close to zero this year. It could even go into recession. So we're not exactly in a strong place here. But now, because of the damage that we've caused and the power imbalance that now exists in the other direction from where it was before, now then it would be, I think, even in my telling, it would be weak. It would be projecting weakness and be inviting, adventurism from Russia if we got rid of NATO now. Okay, don't get rid of NATO now, but let's aspire to do that in the future. And what we should be doing is saying, how can we invest in the future that's going to lead to security and prosperity? And by anybody's telling, security and prosperity can best be accomplished when your threat environment is low, and then you can focus on improving the lives of your people. That's the best condition to get to. However you get there, that's up for debate. What is the worst way to do that? Is to say we're going to just keep building up our military, and we're going to keep spending money instead of improving the lives of our populations of all the different NATO countries. We're going to spend it on building up more capacity to fight these guys. That's what we're trying to do right now. None of this stuff happens in a vacuum, folks. You don't raise up military capacity on one side unless the other side is going to respond. The idea that you can say we're going to build up all this stuff and Russia's going to do nothing is absurd. It's absurd because they already have the power advantage. So if you say, all right, well, we're coming late to the game here, now we're going to start ramping up our stuff until, I don't know, he didn't say exactly what it is, Mark Rutte. Are they going to get to a point to where they think they're going to be equivalent with Russia? Do they want to try to get to a more powerful position? That part wasn't illuminated today. Maybe they will when they get to the summit next week or later on this month, rather, in The Hague. We'll have to wait and see. But right now, NATO is putting itself on a path to ruin. It is not going to be prosperous. It is not going to be secure. It is going to raise the chance of war, not lessen it. And let me point out something. So the speech that Rutte gave today, of course, is all about celebrations and all about strength and, and looking tough. But I'm going to tell you the real deal. So I'm going to break this down into a couple of pieces here. First of all, let's start off, Gary, if you can roll that first part of the tape, and then I'll tell you where to pause.
At the summit in The Hague, I expect allied leaders will agree to spend 5% of GDP on defense. It will be a NATO-wide commitment and a defining moment for the alliance. There are two parts to this new defense spending plan. 3.5% will be invested in our core military requirements, while the rest will go towards defense and security-related investments, including infrastructure and building industrial capacity. Our decisions on defense spending are driven by NATO's battle plans and capability targets. They define what forces and capabilities allies need to provide.
Okay, Gary, if you can stop right there for a second. So what he's talking about there, 5% GDP. It's going to be a defining moment, a quantum leap forward, he says. Okay, let's put this in context here a little bit. Right now, there are It's better than it was, but still there are 8 NATO countries who aren't even at the 2% level right now. Britain is at 2.5%, and they are going to push really hard to get to 2.8%. They were already stretching their budget to get to that. They're already cutting social services, which was making many people in Great Britain unhappy. This is in the earlier months of this year. Now that you want to double that amount to get to 5%. And then you're going to say, yes, all the nations in Europe need to have that same level of advancement. Where's that money going to come from? If you've had all the pressure that so many administrations in consecutive, going all the way back to the Bush administration, maybe you can even go to the Clinton administration, really. Everybody's always been pushing for this 2%. 8 NATO countries still don't have 2%. Other ones are just barely over the top. And look, it doesn't take a lot of figuring out to say, with all of this pressure, and all of them haven't even gotten to 2, some are just over it, then how are you going to now go up to 5%? I mean, number one, I want to see the devil's in the details. I want to see what the plan is. How long do they propose this is going to be? 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? That matters. But that's partially it doesn't either, because still to get to that point, that means every time, however many years it is, each year to increase defense spending, it is a zero-sum game. Unless you're going to literally borrow your way into death and put all this debt on top of you, unless everybody's going to go into debt. Of course, that also means somebody's going to have to be paying that. Where are you going to get these loans from? At what interest rate and all that? Unless you're going to do it that way, the only other alternative you have is to cut benefits for your country or start taxing the wealthy even more. Both of those are hugely unpopular. Raising taxes on anybody is unpopular, but especially the upper class, the people who have clout and economic power and levers to affect the government, they're going to put a lot of pressure on that, I assure you. And if you go the other direction and say you're going to cut benefits for your people, they're going to let you know that they're not happy about that either. And what's incredibly important about this, when you're talking about going up to that level of spending, if you're going to get your population to make those sacrifices, whether it's to pay more in taxes or to have less in capabilities, they have to recognize a threat that you come to the conclusion that, well, this is unpleasant. I don't want to do this, but if we don't, we run the risk of getting rolled over. And that is where, and I don't know if this was already a plan, but certainly it's going to be used by those now in power to get this through. They keep building up the Russian threat as though they're coming for them. We've seen it on and off throughout this war that if we don't stop Ukraine or Russia and Ukraine, then we're next. There's going to be like Hitler 2 is going to come rolling down the plains of Germany and cross into France, maybe go to the English Channel, all this kind of nonsense. I mean, that's stuff in a B-grade movie. A badly written one at that. There is no evidence that Russia has any interest, much less capacity to take on the continent of Europe in a big war. Why would they want to do that? See, there has to be a reason. You can't just say they're coming after us. You've got to say why they want to do it. For example, in World War II, you can see that Hitler said, I want to roll to the English Channel, and because he keep wanting to take stuff with the Sudetenland first, and then the Anschluss in Austria, then he eventually attacked into Poland. They want more room, or they're worried about this, and so they're having this big force of millions of men, and then they have all the armored capacity and the logistics capabilities and the Air Force, everything that he needed to actually act on this, and then you saw him progressively acting more and more on different countries. That's what it looks like when somebody has the intent and the capacity to act on it, and then the countries around didn't have it. That world no longer exists. In 1938, which is what everybody likes to go back to, there were no nuclear weapons. Nobody had them. So all you had was conventional power. Now, both sides have them. So the chance that anybody's army is going to go rolling across conventionally into another and it not go nuclear is virtually non-existent. Because if Russia were to start rolling, like say through Poland and trying to go into the Baltics and going everywhere, the chances of it not going nuclear are very small, maybe infinitesimally small. And likewise, the same thing. The idea that any Western army is going to roll into Russia anymore is virtually non-existent because they would use their tactical nuclear weapons. It's in their doctrine. And it was definitely in our doctrine. I served during the Cold War. I know what our doctrine is. I know what if the Russians or the Soviet Union at that time was starting to move further into Western Europe, if they came across the Fulda Gap that I used to help patrol, then we were going to use tactical nuclear weapons. Nobody's changed that. So don't go back and tell me this is 1938 again, because it ain't 1938 and it never will be again. The conditions are very different right now. So you're telling me now, NATO, that you want to build up an army like it's 1938, but you know it's not, and that it would never be able to be used like it was if it had been 1938 because of the presence of nuclear weapons on both sides of the calculation. That's one of the reasons why nations have those, to forestall that very outcome of an allied or foreign army invading into their country. That virtually prohibits that possibility. So then why build up this big conventional force when nuclear weapons can trump anything that you do? I mean, think about the logic of that, folks. You build up you did say it's 5 years from now or 10, whatever the time frame they've set, and all of a sudden here's all these capabilities, and everybody's spending 5%. Their army's really big, they're training, etc. What are you going to do with it? You think that Russia is going to invade with another big army that they're going to build up to 3 or 4 million, which is what it would take conventionally, and then they're going to come in and then no one's going to use nuclear weapons? That you're going to attack across a broad front on NATO countries, as difficult as that would be anyway, just conventionally even, it'd be really difficult. But if they did, are you going to tell me that the French, the British, or the United States, no one's going to use nuclear weapons and that Russia could just come in? That's why we have to have all this buildup. No, folks, it's not going to. Spend your money where it makes sense, even militarily. This ain't it. And then let me now show you, Gary, if you could bring that video back up here, let me show you specifically what he said they're going to spend the money on.
Last week, NATO defense ministers agreed ambitious new targets. The exact details are classified, but we need a 400% increase in air and missile defense. We see in Ukraine how Russia delivers terror from above. So we will strengthen the shield that protects our skies. Our militaries also need thousands more armored vehicles and tanks, millions more artillery shells. And we must double our enabling capabilities, such as logistics, supply, transportation, and medical support.
Okay, so let's look at what was on the list and what wasn't on the list. So he says we want a 400% increase in air defense. Okay, now that is one identified area that if I was a military anywhere in the world, to include American, and if I was in charge of the U.S., I would say already you are like miles behind for already, and you need to fix that up. If you want to have a conventional deterrent, you damn well better have a better air defense capacity. That is one thing that has been absolutely validated in this war right here, is the side that has the best air defense is almost certainly going to win this. And right now, Russia definitely has the best air defense because both sides have been launching pretty large forays of missiles and drones going back and forth between the border. And Russia's been able to shoot down a significant portion, a very significant proportion of all those coming in. And the Ukraine side is not shooting down anymore. They used to, but now then the percentages are very, very small. And so nearly everything is getting through, or at least great portions of it. And because Russia has more offensive capacity, they can afford to have a lot shot down and still get the stuff through, whereas the other side can't. So building up your air defense is an important thing. You may recall, I guess it's probably 6 or 8 months ago, one of the NATO leaders, it may have been General Bauer, I can't remember for sure, the deputy commander, but one of the leaders said that, by the way, we have like 15%, maybe it was 5 or 15% of the necessary air defense for all of Western Europe. That was, I couldn't believe they actually said that out loud if it was true, but they should have been working on to get that fixed in. You should have built up in your capacity consistently what you need air defense. I mean, it's not a shock that missiles and drones are now a part of the modern battlefield. And if you don't have the ability to shoot those things down, then you're way behind the power curve. And I don't understand why you would be, because that's self-evident that that's where you should go. What good does it do to have a whole bunch of tanks and artillery platforms if you don't have the air defense to keep them safe? because you can't operate in this days unless you have a combined arms operation. And that includes air defense, air offense, the air component, the ground component, engineer, all that kind of stuff, any infantry, etc. You got to have all of it. So you can't put all your eggs in just a couple of baskets and just leave the other baskets empty, like air defense. So, okay, fine. Let's go ahead and improve that. That's something that's important there. But then he said we need thousands more tanks and armor personnel carriers, millions more artillery shells, double the logistics and supply capacity. Now, maybe there was other things, and that's just all he mentioned. But the fact that he didn't even mention drone warfare in the midst of all that, at the top of that list, is itself troubling. Have you not paid attention to see that drones are kind of important today? They're arguably now more important than armor and artillery pieces, though they still have a place. They haven't gone away. The age of the tank isn't dead, but its place in the hierarchy is. When I fought in an armored tank battle against Iraq in 1991, armor was the absolute pinnacle and the king of the battle. It wasn't artillery like it had been in previous wars. Artillery was important, and it did play a big role in there. But armor, tanks, infantry personnel carriers, the Bradley fighting vehicles with their tow launcher, those were the kings right there. In fact, when we went into battle, I'll never forget this, Doug McGregor, who we have on our show all the time, he was the S3, what's called the operations officer in charge of our cavalry squadron. And he told all of us before we went there, the safest place to be on this battlefield is in an M1 tank with your gun tube pointing right toward the enemy, because the frontal armor on that thing could defeat anything that the Soviet era stuff, the T-72s, the T-55s that the Iraqi side had. And he said the safest place to be is going straight toward the enemy, because there's virtually nothing they can do to stop you. And that's exactly how it played out. That ain't the case anymore. Now then, you have to be worried about the drones. Now then, a $2,000 or $3,000 drone can take out that $6, $7, $8 million, $10 million M1 tank. So we have to worry about it. Now you can't lead with the tank anymore. You got to have it, but you can't lead with it. That should have been the number one thing on this list, is the drone issue. Because if you can't master the drone issue, then you can't use your tanks, you can't use your APCs or your infantrymen effectively. So that tells you right now the thinking isn't even right, that wasn't listed first among those other things there. But then you also have to understand, too, about where this is going and the context. Nothing is in a vacuum. Everything is connected. It's all together. Russia is definitely on a military buildup. They have been since February 2022. When Russia started, my analysis is that they thought that this show of force, by flooding in hundreds of tanks and thousands of troops in all different portions of Ukraine, would shock the government into recognizing they couldn't win this war, make them recognizing that the balance of power between the two is irrevocably on the Russian side. So there's continued resistance would be futile and suicidal, so that they would just seek a negotiated settlement, ergo the one that they tried to get in Istanbul in March and April of 2022. Well, that didn't happen, as we know, because the Ukraine side fought ferociously, and then they were convinced or decided on their own, depending on which version of the story you want to listen to, and they continued fighting. And now then Russia's caught short. They got caught with their pants down because they didn't have the force. They didn't have the infrastructure. They didn't have the sustainment. They had nothing that they needed to fight a sustained combat at that point. So they basically just had to hold what they could. And then they ended up spending all of 2023, or nearly all of it, on the defensive after they got ran out of Kharkiv area and abandoned some of the areas in the Kherson in the south. They spent about 12 full months just defending what they had, just digging trenches, making it difficult for the Ukraine side to try to knock them out. At the same time that they started that defensive preparations, they also started the capacity building in the rear. Back in their country, they started ramping up industrial capacity. They started maximizing all of the infrastructure that they had within that. A lot of it was dormant. Now that they've expanded it, they're hiring new people. They're getting new lines of supplies and raw materials, et cetera, getting stuff shipped in from all over the place, everything they need to sustain a war long term. And it took a solid 2 years, maybe even more than that. And from the beginning, probably closer to 3, before they really had stuff up and humming, where the production lines were kicking stuff out. And even to this day, we still see we're now into the 4th year, and in some of the production capacity is still on the increase, meaning that they hadn't completed all of the buildup that they wanted, even within their defense industrial base. Those things are continuing on. And they were able to do that because when they realized just the first few months of the war, especially after the Istanbul attempt to get the negotiated settlement failed, now then they realized, oh, snap, we have to get this right now. And we've got to make some massive changes. Well, you now know you're decisively engaged here, and you are in an existential fight. And so you just, I mean, they gave commands and edicts from Moscow down to the industrial bastion, whatever, and they just executed. It was a form of martial law. I don't think they ever actually went fully to it, but it was effectively that. Whereas the Kremlin said, here's what we got to do, and industry did it. They had no problem with doing that because it's an existential fight that they all recognize. That doesn't exist right now for us. We're not in an existential fight. Our soldiers aren't dying on a daily basis like the Russians were at that time, like the Ukraine side did. Same situation for them. They just went on an all-out mobilization. They did have martial law, etc. And so then they did what they could to make their industrial capacity go up. And obviously it's been bombed and all that from the Russian side. I'm not talking about them for the moment. Let's look at us, though. Our factories weren't bombed. Our people weren't killed. Our soldiers aren't dying, etc. So the populations of our country realize that all the NATO countries, we're not threatened. We're not in an existential crisis. Russia's not going to come rolling across. For crying out loud, after 3.5 years, they barely got 20% of the one country on their border here. And the idea that they're going to now come rolling across us and all of NATO is at threat, again, going back to the nuclear umbrella, you know, if we some weird reason chose not to use it and Russia tried, I mean, you see how hard it is to fight modern offense when you have a prepared defensive line. That's where you want to start putting some money in. Start doing that. You're worried about Russia coming across someday, then build up the flank units, build some defensive fortifications along those lines. Look at what the Surovikin line did. Look at how effective that was in 2023. Look at what the Ukraine side is doing now. One of the big reasons it's taken Russia so long is because the Ukraine side has become masters of defense. Hire some of the Ukrainian leaders who have been built in some of these things, and then send them over to the Western NATO countries. Send them over to the eastern flank and teach. Let it be reversed now. Let the Ukraine side teach the Western NATO countries how to build defensive structures. If you're worried about that, that's what you should do, because you see that when they're prepared defensive lines, it is damn well impossible to move through that in any kind of a form. You also have to have those defensives covered by mainly drones. Yes, artillery is important. It's still a role too, and especially you need armor for local counterattacks and flanking maneuvers, all kinds of stuff. Very important to have, not minor. Ukraine is suffering because of the dearth of that right now. But the biggest reason why Ukraine has continued to hold on is because of their parity in drones. And so that should tell you at the top of this list shouldn't be thousands more tanks and armor personnel carriers. It should be hundreds of thousands more drones and defensive fortifications here. That would be infinitely less costly than to have all of the countries over here, everybody raise up to 5%. That doesn't make any sense at all. That's not even what's useful. If you want to have this whole alliance thing and everybody's working together, then solidify your border. You don't even have to like permanently mar the whole countryside of everybody who's on that flank, but you have to have defensive positions that can be built. I remember when I was stationed in Korea, South Korea in the 1990s, I remember they had all these kind of fortifications that were built that could be executed, that would be turning into blockades or so if they did to. They would bring things down on bridges, some roads, other trench, whatever. So they weren't blocking things at that time, but they could be executed on demand on short notice. And so you can do something like that. So you can also ask the Koreans, by the way. I'm sure they would be willing to help out on how they have it, because they have to defend against that very thing right now, against a potential onslaught from the north coming into the south. And so they don't want to permanently mar the whole countryside. So they have these kinds of things that can be executed on command. but they have them because they recognize it can happen. Same thing here. That is remarkably more cost effective and cheaper than doing it the way that they're having it now. I mean, why should, like France and Germany and the UK spend the same amount that your flank countries should spend here? Because this is where the fight can be stopped, folks. That's how modern warfare works. If you've paid any attention at all to this, to whether it's the Surovikin line in 2023 or to the current lines where the Russians are pushing through now, because they have advantages in nearly every area except drones, that tells you that that's what you need to put your money into. But even aside from that, on the bigger picture, if you want war with Russia, then just keep building up your forces and talking about it all the time. But that's not what we should do, because, like I said, they're already years ahead of us, and we're down here, and we're not existentially threatened. So you're going to have a hard time maintaining this. Whatever number NATO comes out to, they'll have a big celebration, and they'll announce all these 5% targets and all this kind of stuff, and they'll pat each other on the back. Remember 1 year ago when they were in Washington, D.C., where we broadcast live from the side of that, you may recall, the big declaration then was Ukraine will inevitably be invited into NATO one day. Well, now here a year later, that's done. And why is that done? Because a new president came into town. Somebody who didn't believe with that, didn't agree with that, realized how dumb that was, so we're not going to do it. The same thing is going to happen in Europe. You've got all these 32 countries that all have their own independent domestic issues. They have their own elections. The nature of whoever's in charge at any time is constantly changing. And you're going to, and when you start spending this much money and you do what I said a minute ago, which is necessary, we're going to give you, the regular people, less support and less capabilities and less services. And we're going to tax the rich people more. So you have less of your money. Unpopular with everybody here. You can't go too long with that before finally people are going, okay, the Russians haven't come. They haven't rolled into us. You're just taking our money for nothing. You're just depriving us of services for nothing. And then they're going to vote for somebody else who's going to do something different. I mean, look at Brexit, for example. Look at what happened in Romania just now. I mean, you still got Slovakia and Hungary are very different because of who's in charge running their country right now. You see that France Marie Le Pen almost won. They could have changed the course there. All kinds of that's going to happen, which means the chances of this actually producing something that's NATO-wide, all these European countries, to be able to accomplish this goal is extremely low, which means the likelihood is that they're going to try to do something that will impose a cost and a penalty on the people for a while, and it'll end up not producing anything. Nothing of any value will last. It won't be a defining moment unless you want to define it as a disaster moment. It could be that. So we need to be a lot smarter about this and a lot less excited about building up ways to go to war later on. We should be investing, aside from just the more narrow and much more effective and cost-effective method of building up your defenses on the border, which would make it well nigh impossible for Russia to do anything anyway. But then there's the bigger issue. How about investing in peace? How about investing in diplomacy and lowering the temperature to everyone here, to not constantly provide easy fodder for the Russian side to say, this is why we need to keep building up our forces because these guys are. Let's stop that train right now. We can defend ourselves very effectively at something that we can afford right now on our bases. So then let's get this war off the table, because that is one of the biggest source points right now, because of the friction and the activity between the two sides in there that's directed against each other, the whole proxy thing. Get that off the table. Let's start to get that thing solidified and knocked down. And again, you don't trust anything of Russia. I hear this all the time. How can you trust the Russians? Don't trust them. The Russians don't trust us. So why should we trust the Russians? What we need to do is take care of things that we can take care of, like this defensive barrier that I told you about. You can afford that. You can do that. That's something that's fully within your control and will significantly lessen the chance that Russia would ever attack into you. Now then, once that's established, now then we can start worrying about, all right, let's get back into stability between us. Let's get back into, eventually, decades from now even, maybe we can get back into normalized relations. Let's set that at least as a target. and something we can get to do. Because if you get war off the table, if you get active conflict settled, now then you have a chance for emotions to wane, for emotions to cool down, cooler heads prevail, and to people to realize, you know what? We don't have to spend this much to keep us safe because there's better ways to do it. Let's increase our cooperation between the two sides. Let's have more economic interaction, win-win situations, so nobody has to be afraid of the other, and we can get to just a position where we just live together and we exist together without worrying about having a war every other time. See, right now, that's not even being attempted. I'm sure that there are those who listen to this and say, oh, that guy's so naive. I can't believe he would even believe that. Well, it's only naive if you don't even want to try it. Because what we have been doing and what NATO is now saying that they're going to try to do is to be more disastrous and to put us into places where it's going to spend more money, cost more to our people, and increase the chance that we go to war someday. How's that for a price tag? Yeah, sign me up for that. I mean, that's stupid. Why would we go down that path? But that is the path we're on. So before you get too carried away and call somebody naive, just say, let's explore this path. This is the path of wisdom. This is the path that actually has a chance to succeed, to where everybody can live in peace and the chance for war be reduced rationally. And like I always say, there's a reason why I was proud of my service in the military, and I still say it is important, and I'm an advocate of having a strong national defense, so that you're not going to, I'm not saying disarm and just leave it up to the good graces of, a potential opponent. That would be stupid. I'm definitely not on that. But what I am telling you authoritatively is that there is a way to assure your own national defense and lessen the tensions that lead to wars in the first place, and can improve your national security, your economic prosperity at much lower cost with a much higher chance of success. Now, that is something that we should be going after. And anyway, so all that stuff was on my mind today. I know this is kind of late in the afternoon for a show, but when I saw that comment by Mark Rutte and how dangerous it is and how much he could be leading us to economic and ruin and decrease our national security, felt I needed to come and share that with you today. So thank you very much for watching on a Monday late afternoon. And we got some great shows for you coming up tomorrow. We got Doug McGregor back. We got, I think, Commodore Jeremy later in the week. A lot of your favorites, Larry Johnson, who's on the dais in Moscow earlier today, is going to have some tremendous insights coming back on Thursday. Don't want to miss that. We even have a couple of potential surprise guests for you later this week. Still trying to work on that. We'll let you know when it comes in, but you don't want to miss it because we got some good stuff for you this week. Thanks very much, folks. We'll see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.